Thank you so much for coming. We'll give everyone a minute or two to find the right link and join the right room. Nice to see so many familiar folks. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat as you arrive. It's lovely to know who's here. I think we will go ahead and get started. Hello, my name is Joy Mayer and I am the Director of Trusting News. And I'm so thrilled that you took some time today to hear about some research results that we are really excited about, and to hear about what we think it means for journalism and what we plan to do next. We're going to talk you through our research and hear from some of the journalists who helped us do it today. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. Lynn, you want to go ahead and share your screen?
Yes, doing that now.
At any point, feel free to stick some questions in the chat. Introduce yourselves. I know we have some of the journalists here who helped us conduct this research, so please do introduce yourselves, guys, and offer up any additional insights along the way. We are recording this and we'll be happy to share it with people who registered for the event. So if you're not able to, if you're catching this on the replay, no problem at all. Let me just tell you a little bit about Trusting News and why we're here. Trusting News has been around since 2016, and we train journalists on how to demonstrate credibility and earn trust. And this particular research project has grown out of the work we've been doing with local news over years, and more specifically over the past year. Today we're going to tell you about what problem we're working hard to solve right now, what we did to conduct this research, what we learned from the research, what themes we're going to focus on our work next, and how you can follow along or get involved. We'll be using the hashtag Road to Pluralism. If you feel like jumping into the Twitter conversation, go right ahead. So let's talk first about why. I'm just going to set the groundwork a little bit and then hand it over to Gina to tell us about the actual methodology and insights learned. So for this specific research, we throughout election season heard so much frustration from journalists, especially journalists in local newsrooms, through our normal work at Trusting News, through a program called Election SOS that we were partnered with Hearken on. We heard from journalists that they felt like the hill was so steep to climb just to get listened to by certain people in their community, that the assumptions made about their integrity, their motivations, their process, their ethics, their goals, were just getting in the way of too many people even paying attention to what they were doing. We know that this stems from national partisan politics. We know that attitudes about media consumption are very partisan, and that in some cases, especially on the national level, mistrusted news, distrusted news is actually a part of partisan identity. So the numbers just keep getting worse when you look at trusted news overall and you sort that by political affiliation. Only 10% of people who lean right say that they now have at least a fair amount of trusted news. So we've written a lot about research and are always happy to share more about that. But for now, we want to tell you what we're planning to do about it. And Lynn, I did not introduce you at the beginning, so please introduce yourself first.
Yes, thanks, Joy. My name is Lynn Walsh, and I'm the Assistant Director for Trusting News. I've been working with Joy for, I guess, almost 4 years now, which is crazy and very fun. So as Joy kind of set up, we've looked at and probably can relate to the fact that this is a problem, right? That we heard from journalists that sometimes just you're working so hard to get the truth out, but are people believing you? Are people trusting you? We saw that basically this is a problem, right? And so we really want to work with journalists to basically, can we agree that one, this is a problem? Two, if journalists can basically, if they have, if we live in this polarized society and journalism's impact is limited by that problem. We also believe that journalists can benefit from understanding better the problem and where this distrust comes from, And we also believe that journalists share responsibility to address this problem and try to come to possible solutions. And so our goals at Trusting News, specifically with this, we believe that journalists make more informed decisions about what it means to serve the public if they understand the people they aim to serve. So by having these conversations with people who may not be like us, or maybe people that we're not hearing from often, can we better understand them by having those conversations that then will make our journalism better? We also believe, and part of this work is that journalists have an opportunity here and a responsibility to kind of meet this moment with curiosity, determination, and probably most importantly, humility. And we do want to also highlight something as you're thinking about this work, something that this work is not focused on, or what we're not trying to do. So while we believe all of those things to be true, we do not think, though, that journalists should cater their information to appeal to specific political views. We also don't believe that journalists should engage in false equivalencies or play into an individual's kind of hunt for information that confirms their existing views. The whole idea here is to better understand people so we can better serve our communities and make our journalism as good as it can be, and help hopefully get at that problem of distrust, which is so low when it comes to in general, but also specific groups of people. And so I do want to quickly, before we turn it over to Gina to hear about the research learned, I do want to highlight the newsrooms who helped us with this. We had 27 newsrooms that helped us all around the country. You can see pretty well represented across the country, looking at the states and cities, big, small, TV stations, newspapers, online publications. So thank you to those newsrooms. We are really, really appreciative, and we wouldn't have been able to do this work without their help. So with that, Gina, I will toss it over to you.
Thank you, Lynn. I'm Gina Masulo, and I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Media Engagement. I'm also an Associate Professor here at the University of Texas at Austin. And I will tell you, my interest in this topic stems out of my 20 years as a journalist. I was a journalist in upstate New York, most of the time at the Post-Standard in Syracuse, New York. So I really got interested and passionate about helping newsrooms through my research. And this is part of it. I wanted to talk a little bit about, if you can go to the next slide, a little bit about our center. Our center, we are academics, but we are academics that really believe deep down in our soul in doing research that's relevant and practical, which is often a problem in the academy. Our research directly helps newsrooms. We've partnered with more than 170 newsrooms on research projects. We have more than 500 newsrooms using tools and best practices that we have proposed based on our research. And we're always interested in working with new newsrooms. We were excited about this project. We've done other collaborations with Trusting News, as well as a lot in the space of trust. We're very interested in this idea of trust and bias, which, you know, we were a great partner with this, and we also just want to thank the newsrooms who worked with us on it, because it was awesome. Next slide. Oh, great. So in this project, like I said, we teamed up with local newsrooms from around the country, both, broadcast, newspaper, and there was sort of two prongs to it. The first part was a survey where we all asked, more traditional close-ended questions, and they were all of people who consider themselves conservative or right-leaning, like people self-selected into it. We asked them some screening questions to ensure they truly had that belief system. And I wanted to say one quick thing about that before we go on, because I know, because I was a journalist for 20 years, I have a lot of friends who are journalists who, when I first talked about this project, said, well, wait a second, why are you only focusing on conservatives? Why not focus on everybody? And that's an absolute valid point. And my answer to it is this particular project focused on conservatives because trust is particularly low among that group. But we have done many other projects. Joy put into the chat, she and I have teamed up on multiple other projects about trust in the general population. So we're really interested in that as well. So in this project, we surveyed people, and then we asked the people we surveyed, hey, do you want to be interviewed? And they were interviewed by a journalist in their local community. And there was a total of 91 interviews conducted. And you can go to the next slide. So, some of the quantitative findings from the survey, overall trust was low. Trust in news was low. We were not surprised with that. That's why we're doing this project. It was lower for national than local. It was higher for local TV news versus local newspapers. However, people in our study actually read local newspapers more than watched local TV news. You can go to the next slide. Yes. Another big takeaway was that the people who were interviewed for this study felt that the media sometimes lumped them all together and used sort of a quote from somebody who had a more extreme viewpoint as a stand-in for conservative voices. And they felt somewhat uncomfortable with that. And they also felt like there wasn't as many diversity of voices from the conservative side. There would just be one that was a little bit more of a caricature or stereotypical. Next slide. Bias was something that came up again and again and again. When we asked people, what would you like to tell your local news organization? Bias was the most frequent word that came up in all different contexts. And people talked about bias in a lot of different ways in, stories being covered or not being covered, or how journalists ask questions. They sometimes perceived that journalists were accusing them. Now, whether journalists really were, I would hope not, but they sometimes perceived that the question was being asked of a source in an accusatory way. And they also inferred a lot about the journalist's own biases. And some of that may be correct, some of it not correct at all. Next slide. So this is just one quick chart. I just want to situate you. If you look at the darkest orange bar, that is national news in general. So national mainstream news in general has much lower trust than the other three groups and was perceived as much more biased than the other three groups. The other three groups were, the second level of orange is local mainstream news, which you can see the trust is higher and bias perceptions lower. The local news outlet that invited the people actually to participate in the study, so those are our partners. And then the primary news source was the one that was most trusted and perceived as least biased. This was a source people picked themselves. They wrote in a source. It could have been local, it could have been national. The most frequent answer was Fox News for this, but that was only 29% of the responses, so it was certainly not a plurality or a majority. All right, so as I said, we are really committed at the Center for Media Engagement, and I know Trusting News is as well, in doing research that actually solves problems. So we like to have takeaways from it. And these were the takeaways that came out of the interviews. Number one was build relationships. They really wanted journalists to get to know them better. Many people said, we just love that you're doing this project, that you are coming out into our community and talking to us. We want to see more of this, actually listen to us. They really wanted to be cautious that one term wasn't used as a catch-all for a large group of people. So don't use the term conservative to mean a wide range of people who might have very, very different views. They wanted more diversity in hiring. They had a perception that all journalists or many journalists are more liberal leaning. Whether that perception is actually accurate, we can't tell in the study, but that was their perception. That's a tricky one for news organizations, I know, although it's one of those things, and I just want to caution everyone, we are certainly not saying that newsrooms should ask people's political beliefs at a job interview. I think more the idea is to, in your recruitment strategies, try to hit rural areas, more conservative areas, universities and journalism schools, develop relationships with the student newspaper or the advisor to a student newspaper in more conservative areas. That's going to lead you more naturally to perhaps more conservative journalists. You can go to next slide. One thing that came up a lot was this idea of having a narrative, which is a tricky concept, but it seemed to be where they felt like either the use of adjectives in a story were giving a perception to them that there was a slant to it. They wanted things to be very factually based, but then they also raised some issues about things that we associate with factual based information. For example, they really had a lot of concerns about local news using a lot of wire copy from the Associated Press or the New York Times and the Washington Post, because they felt like that they saw the local news outlet as a lot more balanced than the national outlet. Corrections of mistakes came up a lot. This isn't specific to conservatives. Certainly, that's something that our research at the Center for Media Engagement has shown again and again, readers really care about, but we included it because it was some way they assessed trustworthiness, that they felt like, hey, we don't trust you that much. And then when you don't correct a mistake or you don't do it in a really bold way, then we trust you even less. And that's a problem because we don't trust you very much. They also, another takeaway was to be really cautious of the words you use so that it doesn't come across as if you're criticizing one viewpoint and not equally criticizing the other. However, you know, as Lynn said earlier, we don't support false equivalencies. We're not recommending that, but this is a delicate dance to say, you know, to just be cautious of your language, what quotes are included, and that someone reading it who might not understand the way a news story is put together might see it as biased in a way that journalists don't intend. You can go to the next slide. That's the summary. I think we have a time at the end, I hope, for a few questions if anyone has any. You can also, though, shoot us an email if you have questions or sign up for our newsletter on the QR code. We'd love to work with you on future projects and super excited to be here. I guess I will hand it back to Joy and Lynn. Thank you.
Thanks, Gina. Yeah, we will be taking questions throughout and save time at the end. And also we'll share the slide deck with you before the time is over, and we'll email it to everyone who registered as well. So we're very practical at Trusting News. We try to turn these insights into things we want newsrooms to do. And in some cases with this research, the things we heard are things we have been training, like we should label opinion content better, right? And make sure that news consumers know what kind of content they're seeing. Some things we feel equipped to go ahead and start training people on as a result of this. And some things we really feel like we need to ask more questions and stay curious for a while before we turn it into training and actual recommendations. So basically what we're doing is taking these insights and also what we heard as we checked in with all of the partner newsrooms that conducted the interviews with us. And we took their insights and this research insights and are turning them into 5 themes that we would like to dive into. So here are some of our friends from the interviews. Hello. Make sure if you're here and you conducted interviews with us that you have said hello. So in the chat, I mean. So Lynn and I are going to talk you through quickly these 5 themes. And along the way, you will hear from some of these journalists. We have video clips of them sort of reflecting on the process and what really stuck out to them about it. So this first one, you guys, it was really fascinating to see how many of the newsrooms we worked with heard from people that their assumptions about and perceptions of national news really affected their perceptions of local news. And sometimes that's just the media landscape, the narrative trickling down, like, oh, you know, I hate the media. I've been told to hate the media, so I'm going to hate my local media too. But sometimes it was decisions made about how local news presents wire news, whether that's, you know, ABC or CNN content, or, you know, most typically with these research partners, it was the Associated Press. And how do perceptions given about what the news organization values based on how they selected and edited and placed wire content, which in some newsrooms, as it turns out, they don't even have all that much control over. So here's some questions we want to ask about that. What role does wire content play in local news products? Some journalists we've talked to recently are trying to downplay that and see what effect that has. How can journalists reinforce the importance of what they offer their communities and re-examine the role that national stories play? What would it look like to do that? We're going to get some journalists together and sort of you know, experiment around that and see how audiences respond. And are there things about how national news is covered that your audience is telling you feels out of step with their views? And are there things as an industry we should be asking about that? So we have heard from local journalists lately that they're actually publishing more wire content than they used to, in part because staffs are shrinking, and so they have a lot of news flow to fill. But also, I know we have people on the call today who told us that they said their local staff is hardly even involved in wire content. It might be sort of a regional hub that is making those decisions. But the audience man, whether it's your Facebook feed, whether it's what leads your newscast, whether it's what is on your front page or what is filling up your pages, they are absolutely noticing it and holding local journalists accountable for it. Here's a quote from Mark Rosenberg at the Victoria Advocate. National news drives distrust in the media far more than local news. It was surprising, and I think that's supposed to be frustrating to hear. 95% of what I do is local, but the syndicated copy and columns is what is driving distrust. 95% of what this journalist does is local, and yet when he sat down to talk to people about trust, they wanted to talk about wire. So we have a lot of work planned around drilling down on what this means and what changes we might make. Our second theme is also a doozy, the notion of how journalists put people in buckets, how journalists generalize views and contribute to polarization by highlighting extreme views. How do journalists label groups of people and groups of thought? How do we oversimplify or flatten out viewpoints? How do we gravitate toward dramatic or extreme views and reinforce polarization? Some questions we have about this. How can journalists resist the allure of lazy narratives and tell more accurate, more complex stories? I'm such a fan of the concept that Amanda Ripley and Solutions Journalism introduced to me called complicating the narratives. How can we shouldn't journalists make things more complicated and shed more light on complicated views rather than making it seem simple? And how can journalists be more careful about lumping people together and labeling them based on one thing they have in common? Something our partner Mike Cannon at WCPO said, all three people that he personally interviewed expressed extreme dismay about how conservatives were portrayed. Not just Trump, but how individuals and real people were portrayed. It made me think about things in a different way. How often are we painting people in general with too much of a broad brush? So let's hear from some partner journalists.
The idea that conservative is one thing or another is completely shattered by this project, because I think it is a spectrum. And I think there are people that we can talk to and are open to listening to different points of view. So I think we have to continually reach out to those people, and we have to continually engage those people, or we become irrelevant. I think especially in Texas, in a community that we live in where there's a lot of people who are very, very religious, and they have a strong connection to their faith. The fact that we don't regularly cover religion in any significant way really, really impacts them. And I think we can't just write those people off, because there's so many of them. The idea
Thanks, I'll kick it back over to Lynn.
Great, thanks, Joy. So our third theme is about perceptions of stories' fairness. And Gina, when she was talking about her takeaways, hinted at some of this as well. But often news consumers have said they want stories that just give me the facts, include both sides. And they're not just referring to political stories, right? This came up a lot in conversations that journalists had with societal issues, life in general, kind of things that were happening around them. And so the idea is, how can we make sure that all of our reporting is fair? And Joy kind of hinted at some of those generalizations, but are there other things that we can make sure that people understand, one, what is news and what is opinion? I think that's a big thing that came up a lot, but also just, are we being fair? Who are we talking to with when we're addressing these issues, especially some of the social issues and political issues that come up? And so some questions that we have, what makes a story fair? What makes a story balanced? I mean, I think if we got together and kind of answered that question as journalists, we probably would come to some common things that we kind of agree on. But then, are we explaining that to our users and our viewers and our readers? Are we telling them how we're working to be fair and balanced? What makes something feel slanted or opinionated? I mean, it could just be the way a headline's written. It could be what you decide to highlight in that headline, or when you're sharing it on social, right? What is that focus? So when you're doing that, how can we make sure to be more fair for everyone in the community so they don't instantly see a headline and kind of come to an assumption or a misassumption about what we are doing? And then how do these elements play out in decisions journalists make day to day about things like sourcing, word choice, headline writing, and then really something that I think we can kind of all commit to, and we can get there. I think we're slowly kind of getting better, but can we label and describe opinion content more clearly and just differentiate it so our viewers know the difference and understand that there is a difference, and that those people that are sharing opinions aren't influencing the news coverage and the news decisions? And so some things that we heard from newsrooms, and I also have some clips to play as well, but they heard from people that people perceived bias and a lack of consistency in things like phrases that are put into quotes, when an official's political party is mentioned. This came up a lot. So when do we decide to identify if someone is a Republican or a Democratic lawmaker, right? And are we consistently using those labels and using them within stories? When is it pointed out that someone is running for office? And then when are other sides included? So are we always doing that? Or something that happens a lot in television, I know with my experience, is you send one reporter to cover people who might be for an issue. You send another reporter to cover who's maybe someone who's against the issue. And we don't connect them necessarily. In the newscast, they're connected, they play back to back. But when we share that content online, are we connecting it for people? Are we making sure that we're showing them that we are covering the full story? And so here we have a clip from Allison Collins at the Chattanooga Times Free Press, who addresses that, a little bit of this issue.
One thing that became really apparent in interviews is there isn't just one big thing that we can fix to regain trust among our conservative readers. Some told us it's about the verbs and adjectives we sometimes use to describe things. You know, did Trump crow about that, or can you just say he said that? Others said it's the stuff we don't include in the story and the context that we don't provide that makes them trust us less, or the voices we use are only the extremes and they feel like their position is never represented. Others said it's sometimes the placement of the stories on the page or the website and in our email newsletters. And while we're still thinking of ways we can implement changes in our newsroom, when it comes down to it, every single reporter and editor in the newsroom, just need to be more aware of why we choose the stories that we do, why we write them the way we do, and why we promote those stories the way we do across all of our platforms. One thing that became really apparent.
And next we have Clytie Bunyan from The Oklahoman.
Readers want balance in reporting, but they don't want to be led. They want just the facts and only the facts so that they can come to their own conclusions. They don't want the subjective adjectives or analysis or anything that they believe is leading them toward a conclusion. They become highly offended if they feel they're being led. They want to make up their own minds. Of course, that mindset in itself is very subjective because a very picky reader will always find something to complain about. I think our readers still want content that reflects a reporter's opinion, but it should be labeled for what it is, opinion.
And so this brings us to our fourth theme, bias in the newsroom. And I think this is one that, again, relates to a takeaway from Gina, but the whole idea of, are we looking at who is in our newsrooms and are we trying to make them as diverse as possible? Yes, this is about race, this is about ethnicity, but it is also about where people are from, what are their backgrounds, what is their prior experience. It's about socioeconomic status. It's about, are they from big cities? Are they from, if you're in if you're a newsroom in California, where are all your reporters from? If they're all from California, that's potentially problematic, right? We want to make sure we are diversifying in all sorts of different ways. And so why is that important? Because it influences a lot about story selection. And we're going to hear from some newsroom partners that talk about that. But who is in the newsroom is going to determine what you are doing, what stories you're covering, how you're covering them. And at the end of the day, if we want to cover stories as best we can, it's better to have more of those viewpoints in the newsroom. And so how can we do that? And how are we looking at what that bias is? So some questions that we have How do newsrooms know how their own worldviews and experiences align with their communities? How can journalists learn to recognize their own biases and blind spots? And I think this is something that sometimes is difficult. Are we ready to have these conversations and be respectful of letting people be open about how they are different and what they bring to the table? And do people feel comfortable bringing that up in a morning meeting or when people are talking about stories? And that's something that we really do want to work on, is having, when you have the diverse people in the newsroom, then can people feel comfortable bringing this up and speaking up? And that's something that we hope we can get to in questions that we have. And so this is a clip from Aki Soga from the Burlington Free Press, who talks a little bit about that.
I think a lot of our news coverage is driven by the lives that we live, and made me think that's not necessarily everybody's experience. I mean, I kind of knew that. I mean, you know, the people in the newsroom are generally, you know, well, they all have at least a 4-year degree, some have a master's degree, you know, and if not, I mean, because we don't pay that great, we're not, you know, in absolute dollar terms, we probably aren't, you know, middle to upper middle class, but certainly in outlook and attitudes, we probably more align with that socioeconomic
something
group.
else that Aki said was during that interview is he had mentioned how, you know, the question came up, like, do they have a veteran that works in the newsroom? That was just kind of a specific instance and question that came up. And I think those are the kinds of things that we're talking about, like who is in our newsroom. And then if we find out we don't have anyone that has experience in the military or is a veteran, how are we filling that gap? And so this goes beyond political leanings. This goes more to just who we are as people. And it's a lot of different things, including race, socioeconomic status, education, all of that. And I'm going to hand it to Joy to talk about our fifth theme.
One thing that is so interesting, both in this project and in a previous project where we recruited newsrooms to sit down with their own news consumers, is how much they said that they got out of the experience of just investing in understanding the people they aim to serve. And in both projects, I think Gina would back this up, we heard this time real gratitude from the people who were being interviewed, from the participants in the study, that they felt it built trust, that we made it clear we wanted to hear from them, and that we took time to listen to them. Now, of course, it's important to acknowledge at this juncture that the people who self-selected into this research were not the people with the most extreme views and the most extreme distrust. If you are willing to spend an hour sitting and talking to a local journalist, you have to believe that you have to believe they want to change. You have to think they're worth the investment of your time. And so the whole world is not made up of people who would be grateful for an hour to spend with the journalist. But the people who did identify as right-leaning, the study talks about which labels they felt like applied to them. Conservative was often the case, but not always the case. And did have fairly low trust in news compared to the overall population. We're really grateful for this experience. And so one thing we're always thinking about at Trusting News, but especially with this new initiative we're launching, we're really focused on what it looks like to build that time for outreach and listening into journalism. So some questions we have about that are, how can we build that into our routines, that sort of continual learning about that? And, you know, there are some newsrooms that do a good job of kind of more informally just checking in with people, you know, find new subscribers to a newsletter, or people who've canceled a subscription or something, just have a conversation and say, tell me what you think of what we're doing and how we can do better. And how can those efforts in outreach and listening meet people where they are and respect their sometimes really valid hesitancy or unwillingness to engage with us at all? It's not some huge benevolent gift we're giving them to ask for their time. They don't owe that to us. We need to respect that it's a gift they're giving us. Madeline in Jefferson City said, I really enjoyed the conversations. They were far more pleasant than I thought they would be. They were very heartening, honestly. They made me more hopeful than I had been previously. That's something we heard over and over. So we wanted to take a minute and just tell you what we're doing next and how you can get involved in it. And then we will be happy to open it up for your questions. So really, since the seeds of what we're doing now as we mentioned at the beginning, were really planted during election season, thinking there has got to be a better way. Here are all the things we're noticing that are wrong with public discourse that are, that are preventing us from sort of collaborating as society as we try to self-govern. And how does journalism and how does local news specifically have an opportunity and an obligation to improve that situation? So our new initiative is called A Road to Pluralism, helping journalists strengthen trust across the political spectrum to bridge divides, foster productive conversations, and fuel open-mindedness. We want to fuel curiosity, not reinforce assumptions. So we started with research, as Gina was saying, specifically about conservatives because trust is has historically been low and is getting lower compared to the overall population. Our project, A Road to Pluralism, is not just about conservatives. It is about this goal we have of the kind of democracy we have in mind and the role journalism plays in that. So we want to foster local journalism that helps people understand each other, communicate with each other, and work together to solve problems. So super simple goals like that. So there are 4 ways that we hope that you will get involved with us. The first one is to follow along with our weekly newsletter, and Molly will stick a link to that in the chat. If you have sort of casual interest and you just want to get updates about what we're up to, we will start adding sections to our weekly Trust Tip newsletter that kind of update you on this project. So we'd love to see you there. The 5 themes that Lynn and I talked you through, for the next 5 weeks, we're going to be drilling down into each of those. We're going to be writing more on Medium and in our newsletter about what we heard and what our partner journalists heard. And then we're going to be hosting a conversation each Thursday afternoon at this same time, or morning if you're on Pacific time. That's just that's not presentation based, that we're involving our partner journalists in those conversations and are just going to say, here's some of what we learned. What can we as an industry do? How could committed local journalists work at addressing each of these things? Our goal at Trusting News is to bring strategies back to the industry overall. And so we're really hoping that some of you are willing to see in our work some problems that you want to solve as well, and are willing to do that collaboratively with other newsrooms so that we can report back to the industry about what we're all learning together. Another element of our Road to Pluralism project that we'll announce more about soon is a series of public Q&As. We as a team have been doing a lot of just reading and talking to really smart people in and outside of journalism about the notion of pluralism, about bridging divides. And we have a lot of people whose brains we want to pick about what we as local journalists can be doing about that. So we'll do that in public so everyone can benefit from it. So we'll be announcing in our newsletter and on Twitter how you can follow along in those conversations. And then the biggie is our new pluralism network. So we are going to collaborate and experiment together around real change. And we invite you to apply for that. And the link is here. Basically if you just have casual interest, feel free to follow along. If you think that you and your newsroom would be willing to actually try some things, whether that's engaging in comments differently, adding notes to story, making changes to how you handle wire content, making changes to how you label opinion content, we are going to be putting together sort of cohorts of journalists willing to really wrestle with each of these themes. And I'm sure we'll be adding more and tweaking these as we go. So if that's something that your newsroom is interested in doing, then please do apply. You'll be added to our Slack workspace and added to channels based on which of these themes you're interested in, and you'll connect to other local journalists who are committed to that same work as well. Oh, one other quick thing before we go to questions. We just wanted to get a plug in for another class we're offering that is also about reaching out to people who have historically low trust in news. We have been teaching for a few years now a 4-week Trust 101 class, and we're excited this fall to be offering a 4-week cohort specifically dedicated to earning trust with communities of color. We're asking people to apply in pairs for this class, so 2 people from a newsroom would apply together. And we're co-teaching that with Lachelle Crittenden from Thomas Jefferson University. So we'll start looking at applications in early September for that. So please do apply and let us know if you have questions. And here is our all the ways to contact us. We'd love for you to keep in touch. And we will stick a link to this slide deck in the chat so that you can grab all the links and that sort of thing. And I think now we will open it up to questions. Thanks so much, everyone. So if Molly, I don't know if you've noticed things in the chat that you want to bring to our attention, or if people want to just unmute themselves, that's fine as well. Molly's having tech trouble, so we can't actually hear her today. So we're just going to rely on you guys to. I'll open the chat too. But if folks want to just unmute and ask questions, feel absolutely free.
Hi, Matthew from KCUR in Kansas City here. I was curious, one thing that occurred to me as a potential solution, I'm curious if people are already doing this, but like having community advisory boards or regular like feedback with folks who are conservative, because as mentioned by others who participated in this, like I did find it really useful just to like have that structured time to be like, what did you think of our work? And what, you know, how does it impact you? And where do you think we do well and poorly and that kind of thing. I was just curious if there were examples that you either knew of news outlets already doing that and what works well and what doesn't work well for that. And if not, well, then maybe that's something to pursue.
Yeah, I think that's great. I just stuck a link in the chat to some work I'm inspired by that McClatchy's doing around community advisory boards and specific to opinion sections. I do think that that is a great way as we look at identifying newsroom blind spots. I mean, advisory boards are there to help keep you in touch with what's on the minds of the community and with what they think of your work, right? So advisory boards targeted to specific groups of people, to specific interests, I think are absolutely worth pursuing. And if folks have experience with that and want to share that, I'd love to get an email from you.
Joy, can I ask a question?
Sure, Mike.
So here we are in the midst of this long overdue change in our newsroom to make our newsrooms look more like our community. And some of our newsrooms, that's been a real struggle. The faces we see looking back at each other are predominantly white. And so here we are talking about a kind of diversity that brings in really more white voices again. And so there seems to be, and I get it, and that's why I'm here to try to thread this needle, but the internal message becomes complicated, right? We've been telling our reporters to reach out to diverse communities, to talk to people of color. And now comes this message, which is needed, but seems to be in conflict. So do you have any advice for really sort of communicating that internally?
Can I jump in and answer that? I think that is a really great question. And I would say two things. One is our takeaway from this is not to don't talk to diverse voices that are racially diverse. What the conservatives were saying wasn't add more white people. They were saying have more diversity within conservatives. In fact, we had conservatives of color who said, why don't you diversify in terms of race and age of conservative voices? Like, don't only quote white people. So it's not an either or. You're right, though, that in some, it does tend to run the risk of adding more white voices. And that's a challenge, especially as stories get shorter and we know the attention for longer stories is limited. But I would be very cautious of that takeaway. Like the real takeaway is what they were saying in the interviews, the big takeaway we got out of it was, don't just quote one conservative voice as a stand-in for all conservatives and have that voice, as one of our interview participants say, you know, the pickup truck with the Confederate flag off the back, like quote other voices within that sphere. So I think that is a caution, and we're certainly not recommending to shut out voices that are diverse racially or by sexual orientation or gender. Absolutely not. It's a really important point.
As Gina mentioned, it's not, it's about complexity and diversity and nuance within those viewpoints. It's also not just about volume. A lot of what we heard was that people perceive sort of a tone or an assumption or like sort of a worldview in the coverage. Like journalists had their minds made up about which was the correct answer or which was the good guy and the bad guy in a story. And so it's definitely not just about highlighting more voices. It's about telling more complex stories in a lot of ways. Let me address a comment I see in the chat from Matt. who says, how do we develop trust if many people do not agree on what the facts are? Absolutely fair question, and it's something we have talked about a lot. I think, you know, we have always talked about trust as a big spectrum, and there are people on the far end of the spectrum who think everything we've done is made up and who are persuaded that what we're telling them is invented and that none of it's true. And that's not who we're targeting. We're not saying every viewpoint needs to be reflected. We're not saying that we need to cater to people who do not share our reality or believe in facts. We're saying that there's more nuance than what we're often reflecting, and that we can have a version of reality that allows for different people's experiences within that reality. We're not saying for a second that we should hedge our bets about basic facts. All right, it is 2:45, and we did intend to go just 45 minutes. Want to respect your guys' time today. Thank you so much. I think we'll stick around in case anyone had a question they were dying to get in, and we'll send the video and the slide deck around. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time.